9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainstorm. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 21. Machine Manor. The spy machine was looking over the fabrication machine, making quite sure that all of its mechanics were in working order. As it did so, the larger monster sparked with anticipated victory. It was finally going to have a soul to power it. It wouldn't be taken away from it again. However, it needed the spy machine to ensure it was strong enough. If it wasn't, and it tried to take a soul, then both would be destroyed. Everything for the machines would be over in an instant. However, it was more than powerful enough to take the soul. And once it did, there would be nothing to stop it from finally taking what rightfully belonged to it. The fabrication machine shrieked as the spy machine ran a claw past the talisman. Raising a clawed arm, it knocked the smaller machine to the ground. It had lost the talisman once, and it wasn't about to do so again. It was nearly strong enough the real war was about to begin. Irritated, the spy machine gave a snarl and got to its feet. It could only step gingerly onto its injured foreleg, the snapped cables making the appendage extremely difficult to operate. As the spy machine prepared for the rise of the fabrication machine, the latter tinkered with the body of a small spider-like beast. These were fairly simple creatures to create and made it effective soldiers. The spy machine watched for a moment, sitting on its haunches, snarling to itself, and keeping well out of the reach of the fabrication machine. 5, still alive, was sitting in the same lamp that 9 had been trapped in when the war had started. He was sitting in the corner, head buried in his arms. His knees were brought to his chest, arms wrapped around them. He was trembling all over, sobbing silently, frightened out of his mind. He had healed his arm by himself, but now his pack lay forgotten beside him. The poor Stitchbunk had given up to distress and panic that overcame him. It was over. He was going to die again. He also cried for his friend. 9 had been torn apart and electrocuted. 5 knew that he was extremely strong, but it would be near impossible to live through such a terrible injury and then endure a shock like that. Their bodies could only take so much. Try as he might to convince himself that his best friend was still alive, 5 just knew that he was gone. He didn't even have the chance to try to save him before he slipped away. He had to get himself captured by the machines. He didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. Suddenly, the spy machine snarled at him through the glass. Its razor teeth glinted in the late afternoon sun that shone through the high windows of the clock tower. The noise this damn thing was making was driving its hearing sensors crazy. 5 was shrieking, still carrying out an overwhelmingly terrified. Giving a sharp snort, the spy machine picked up the lamp in its jaws and its fangs scraped against the iron and glass, making an unbearable noise. 5 had to cover his hearing sensors, grimacing. The machine then sharply tossed its head, throwing the lamp into a lavish maroon tapestry. Handing from the wall. The embroidery was yanked from the wall as the lamp became entangled with elegant fibers. 5 was stumbling against the glass. The back of his head smashed against one of the iron bars. He slumped over, dazed. His vision darkened. The spy machine then reared before the lamp cage and brought its claws down upon it. The bars bent under the pressure of its weight, and the glass shattered. Five was immediately knocked unconscious as he collapsed into the remains of the shattered glass and twisted iron. The spy machine seemed to smile smugly as it turned away from the cage in the back of the fabrication machine, flickering its tail in satisfaction. The irritating noise was gone. Suddenly, a gigantic iron claw enclosed the spy machine. It shrieked in anger as it was lifted into the air. The fabrication machine screeched in rage, sparks of fury surrounding its single glowing eye. It slammed the spy machine on the ground in warning. The other machine struggled to its feet, snarling. The fabrication machine went back to creating the spider beasts. This was getting tiresome, keeping the spy machine under control. It had been programmed to kill the pieces of the scientists upon contact, not wait tirelessly until the machine was strong enough to consume the soul. However, it wouldn't be long now. Soon it would be released to hunt down the little pieces of the scientist itself, and finally defeat them all. Nine crept silently through the citadel, hiding behind a wall. He had heard the commotion and rushed ahead of the others, breaking into a run when he heard Five shout. As he peered hesitantly around the corner, he laid his eyes on a crumpled, lifeless form of his friend. His heart plummeted as his eyes widened. He needed to get over there, now. The others stood behind him, silent and ready to put the plan in motion. He heard Two's quiet gasp as he saw his son's lifeless form, slumped over in the glass. Five placed a hand reassuring on his shoulder, pointing to the spiraling staircase that led up to the clock tower. The old inventor nodded, clutching his invention tightly. Five waved him, Six and the twins toward the staircase, and the four crept across the hall and started sprinting up towards the clock tower. The machines didn't even notice Eight followed them, then hid behind a corner, on the other side of the hall, guarding the others. Seven stayed as one acted as lookout, standing high on a stack of dusty books. He would tap his staff against the wall to act as a cue. Then took a step forward to go to Five. As he passed Seven, she gave his shoulder a brief squeeze of compassion. The plan was in motion. 6, 3, and 4 were soon at the topmost floor of the citadel. The clock tower was located in the smaller room, enough for two fully grown human males to fit inside. They were facing a gigantic cracking brass bell, with elegant writing engraved on the side. The mechanics that swung the bell back and forth were old, but undamaged. Two was hiding in the corner, fingers tightened around the invention that would distract the spy machine. There was a distant crackling. There was a distant clicking, one staff being softly tapped against a piece of metal. It was their cue. Six, with a small cry, jumped onto the rope and began to swing himself back and forth, hanging perilously over a wide opening underneath the bell. 4 joined him, then 3. With their combined effort, the large bell swung back and forth. It rung with deafening clangs, making the 3 young Stitchpunks' entire body quiver. Their arms shook with the strength of the rings. Two held his invention tightly, ready. With a snarl of anger, the spy machine turned away from the machine and went to investigate the ringing. The fabrication machine urged it on while it tried to finish the spider beast. The invention held by Two immediately began to blink against the window, illuminating a ragdoll silhouette. 5 had been right. It was dark enough within the citadel to where only a Stitchpunk shadow would be seen. 3 and 4 then heard the spy machine as it raced upon the long, winding staircase, its roars mangled with the clangs of the bell. Perhaps another seeker had found something up there, something that didn't belong here. The twins shared an apprehensive glance. With one last great swing, they jumped off and landed ending squarely on the platform. They turned, waving frantically to Six. He nodded frightenedly and tried to jump off after them. However, a few yards below, the spy machine's shoulder that enabled the unstable stone wall caused the entire structure to shake violently. The heavy rope was jerked out of Six's hands, and he cried out as he fell. He reached out and tried to grab the platform, but his fingers closed on empty air. 3 and 4 lashed out with their hands and clamped down upon Six's delicate fingers, bracing themselves on the platform. Six was trembling all over. His eyes widened. The twins pulled backwards and managed to heave the older Stitch Punk back into the platform. He sat on his knees, panting, quivering violently. The twins stroked his shoulders reassuringly, while 2 still stood by in the entrance, leaving the device propped up against a small pile of rubble. "Lads, my boys, come on," he whispered to them frantically, waving them over. Suddenly, his head snapped to look at the staircase, and he gasped. The spy machine then exploded into the room, snarling wildly. It looked straight to where 2, 6, and the twins were sitting, and all 4 boys froze in extreme horror. The spy machine lunged at the 4, only managing to make out of his grasp. It snarled, irritated, eyesight corrupted by that wretched zippered one it had killed. The room was too dark for it to see clearly. Everything was blurred, and it only saw the shadowy movements of the parts of the scientist. It snarled again and lunged blindly. The cry was silent, but heard all the same. The teeth of this machine sliced into 4's tiny leg. His mouth was open in a silent cry of pain, and he clutched the tear of his thigh. The spy machine reared once more, knowing it had injured one of the dolls, and went down to deal with the final blow when a flashing light caught its eye. It turned to see where the light was coming from. Near the window, there was a rag doll, standing silent, too frozen to move. The red light of the Seeker surrounded it, making it easy to see. The spy machine roared in triumph. It lunged forward and clamped its jaws upon the light. Its large head crushed through the glass pane, and it nearly hurled itself into the window. Shards of glass and wood rained down on the ground far below. Its right foreleg up to its shoulder, and its head hung into the window, into a cold evening air. It pulled back, but couldn't get back into the room. It was stuck tight. It snarled and roared in frustration and fury, trying to pull itself out of the window, its tail thrashing around wildly with a whistling sound. Six groped around in the quiet, quickly falling darkness. He finally found the twins, 3 protecting his brother with his life. Come on! We must go! We must!" 6 told him quietly, taking his hands and tugging gently. 3 got to his feet and cried to coax 4 to his own, holding his hand tightly. 4 attempted to get up, but as soon as he put any kind of pressure on the injured leg, he fell to the ground, whimpering silently. 3 flickered to him, begging him to get up. 6, however, immediately took 4 into his arms. He heaved him around, tucking his arms underneath his legs and making sure his arms were wrapped around his neck. He couldn't explain it, but something within him told him that he could not leave the little one behind. He looked up to see 2 standing as well, leaving the device behind. They ran out of the room and down the staircase, 4 clinging tightly to 6's shoulder, and 3 and 2 running behind. The fabrication machine had turned away from the crushing lamp and was spinning an extensive, delicate wire through the core of the spider beast. It sparked as the sound of the relentless siren was finally cut off. It needed to concentrate. These beasts would be extremely useful to hunt down the souls of the scientist, just waiting to be used for its power. Len looked up at the machine. He made sure that it was occupied and wouldn't notice him. Slowly and quietly, he climbed through the rubble, where the destroyed lamp lay behind it. 9 lifted a heavy tapestry off the cage, and his heart dropped when he saw that 5 wasn't moving. He didn't even look like he was breathing. 9 glanced at the fabrication machine once again before reaching through the iron bars of the cage. He could just barely get his arm through the bars. But once he managed to do so, he placed a trembling hand on 5's shoulder. 5? He asked softly, giving his shoulder a small shake. 5 remained motionless and silent. 9 shook slightly harder, his heart compressed tightly in fear. 5? 5, come on, bud, wake up. I didn't give up. You can't either. I didn't come all this way for you to... 5, just wake up, please. 9 pleaded softly, his voice hitching. When his best friend didn't reply, he began to tremble. 5's single eye remained closed. He lay motionless, lifeless, and silent. 9's chin began to quiver. No, not like this. He just got him back. He couldn't lose him. Not his best friend. 5, he whispered fiercely, voice breaking. He gave 5 another shake, trying once more to desperately wake him up. The older stitch punk remained silent. His head merely fell onto one side, and his body slumped against the bars. 9 shook his head in disbelief. No, he whispered, sinking to his knees. The grief was overwhelming, and his head slid from 5's shoulder. He was too late. He had lost his best friend again, and this time he couldn't bring him back, and it was his fault. Everything was his fault. 9 rested his forearm against the bars of the cage, his shoulders heaving as he struggled to keep up from crying out. He clamped a hand over his mouth, his body racked in silent sobs. He could only think about 5, lying dead before him, crying so hard that he had felt like needles were being driven into his chest. But he didn't care about the pain. All he cared about was that his best friend was gone, and it was all his fault. 9. The only voice he needed to hear in those moments, asked weakly. 5's eyes snapped open as he looked up with a shaky gasp. 5 was alive, blinking wearily and peering down at him. 5? He cried hoarsely, getting shakenly to his feet. He didn't even notice the pain that sheared through his body. His heart rejoiced, and overwhelmed relief washed over him as he faced 5 and smiled widely. 5's face also broke into a wide smile as he turned and stood as best as he could at the crushing lamp. 9, you're okay, he cried, reaching through the bars of the lamp and clasping 9's shoulder. Relieved beyond belief, 9 reached forward and clutched his upper arm, his entire body shaking from weakness and elation. 5 then lifted his hand from 9's shoulder and reached for him. 9 slipped his arms through the gaps of the cage with iron bars between them. They embraced tightly, relieved that the other was still alive. 9 could feel 5 trembling in his arm, but he didn't care. He merely tightened his grip. I thought it killed you, 5 whispered into his friend's shoulder, giving a shuddering sigh. We stick together, remember? 9 replied, gripping his best friend desperately, closing his eyes tightly and wishing the war was over. He gently rubbed the back of the older burlap stitch punk. Right now, the pain in his body didn't matter. 5 was alive. His fingers tightened around the mechanic's shoulder, feeling as if this horrific nightmare finally had a light at the end of the dark tunnel. They drew apart and smiled, relieved to be reunited once more. Now let's get you out of here. He picked up his staff and used the blade to pick the lock of the cage. However, the spy machine had jammed the sharp piece of metal inside the lock to ensure the fabrication machine didn't have another fugitive. 9 hooked his blade through the lock and pulled, strained as his body protested the action. 5 pushed against the rusted hook on his lock, trying to work it through the bars. Suddenly, the fabrication machine jerked itself across the room in which it resided, making the entire citadel shake. The cage door jolted open with the force, causing 5 to stumble forward, and 9 to fly backwards, landing on his side painfully. He gave a small cry and clutched the injured side, emitting a small, unvolatile groan. 9! 9! 5 cried softly as he looked up, rushing over, falling to his knees beside him. I'm fine. I'm fine. 9 said, voice strained, looking up at 5. He winced again, the pain making it harder to breathe, let alone speak. No, you're not. You're still hurt. What in the world were you thinking? 5 asked in desperation, his voice a fierce whisper, as not to attract the fabrication machine. He leaned over 9, his eye widened in fright. I needed to come after you. I wasn't even going to lose. I was never going to lose you again. His finger tightened on Lou's wound. Oh, damn. Come on, we gotta get you out of here, 5 said, helping a trembling 9 to his feet. No, wait. We have a plan. We're getting the talisman back, 9 said, struggling out of 5's grasp and running the fabrication machine. 9, no! 5 cried a fierce whisper, but 9 shot him a look that immediately silenced him. He waved at 5, mouthing to him to hide, and he did so. Looking over his shoulder, he caught just a glimpse of 7 hiding behind a wall. 9 took a deep breath, then stepped out and picked up a piece of rock, raising his arm. He lobbed it as hard as he could into the machine's thick metal body. A small clang it made was drowned out of the whirring and gigantic mechanics of the fabrication machine whirling around. Hey! Remember me? 9 shouted up to the fabrication machine, clutching his blade tightly in his hand. As its single eye laid upon 9, sparks surrounded it as it shrieked. The sound echoed throughout the entire citadel. 9 stood his ground, staring right back at the machine. 5 gasped in horror, not knowing what his friend was about to do. It appeared as if 9 was attempting to sacrifice himself so the others could retrieve the talisman. But this was not the case. How delightful. One of these little creatures was practically giving himself to the machine. Well now, it was strong enough to take the soul. As it stared down the ragdoll, it recognized it as the one that stole the talisman and killed it in the first place. It wasn't going to escape this time. The fabrication machine closed its eye, powered down for just a few moments. The talisman glowed familiar, eerie, deadly green. The plates snapped open, electricity crackling around them. 9 forced himself to stay rooted to the spot, despite the fear coursing through him. He bent his knees, readying himself. The deadly light shot out of the talisman, striking right for him. Time seemed to slow as 9 sprinted right underneath the lights. They curved to follow him, and tried to steal his soul. He could feel the pure energy of the strands of lightning nearly brushing his cheeks. However, as 9 dove under the machine, all the lights succeeded in doing was snapping back into the talisman. Because the machine didn't capture 9, the lights could not reach him. The plates on the talisman snapped shut, and the device automatically shut off. 9 reeled for a moment, amazed that his insane plan had actually worked. Before the machine recovered, 9 cupped a hand around his mouth and screamed, "Now!" 7 and 8 rushed forward, their weapons held out in front of them. 7's eyes glinted from the shadowy sockets of her skullmet, and 8 growling from underneath his colander helmet. The 2 warriors were rushed to the machine as its eyes rotated open. It screeched, confused that it didn't feel the awesome, revitalizing power that a soul could grant it. 7 and 8 began to spontaneously attack it, stabbing here, severing a cable there. The machine screamed and tried to grab the 2 with its iron claws. They, however, were too quick. They dodged each attempt the machine had to grab them. As the machine was distracted with the warriors, Nine was struggling to pry the talisman from the monster. He had jammed the tip of his pen blade into the socket, pulling backwards, as strongly as he possibly could. However, every time the machine swerved and tried to catch 7 and 8, 9 was carried along with it, his side sheared with torturous pain. 9 grimaced, struggling to ignore the pain to get the talisman out of the socket. He pulled and pushed against the hilt of his staff as hard as he could, crying out. His strength was drained fast. They were rapidly running out of time, and this was his last chance. Suddenly, flying out of nowhere, was 5. He left for the blade, just as 9 was pulled his hardest against it. 5 grabbed his hilt, wrenching it backwards. With the combined efforts of the 2 young males, the talisman was suddenly ripped from its socket, sending the 2 flying and tumbling over one another as its freed talisman clattered to the ground. The machine shrieked, electricity crackling around its eyes as it shuddered. The power drained from its body rapidly. The Stitchpunks had to get out of there immediately.
"Come now! Get out of there! We must run!"
One yelled out, beckoning them forward with his staff. 9 reached out and grabbed the talisman, holding it tightly to his chest. As he struggled to his feet, 5 seized his injured friend under his arms and helped him run across the cobbled floor. 7 and 8 were soon beside him, running as fast as they could to the door. The machine quickly followed them, reaching for the little zippered ragdoll that had the talisman, but it could not move fast enough. Weakened by the loss of its power, the entire citadel shook and collided with the door frame that was too narrow to go through. From the staircase came 2, 6, and the twins, 4 still holding tightly to his friend's shoulder. The 9 scrambled out of the cracks of the door. All alive, all safe, they ran into the open, leaving the citadel behind them. The plan had worked. The spy machine managed to free itself from the window, and was now joining the fabrication machine. The larger monster was skulking in the middle of the room. That was the second time those damn ragdolls had escaped its clutches, and now they had taken its talisman. That was the last time they would ever do so, no matter how long it took, no matter what the cost. He would see that all 9 Stitchpunks were dead, and their souls used as its power. The spy machine crept forward, snarling as it noticed the talisman was now missing again. It had been fooled. The machine shrieked at the spy machine, demanding the other half of its orb. The spy machine snarled, but reluctantly opened its chest and severing its heart. It placed the glowing half of the orb into the machine again, feeling its body weakening immediately. However, it was only way the machine could finally win the war. The fabrication machine roared, feeling the energy of the orb surge through the mechanics. It knew it needed repairs, but soon it would be able to detach itself from the citadel and go after the ragdolls itself. Giving a quick demand to the spy machine, it prepared itself to undergo repairs it needed. The 9 souls were going to suffer. It was going to snap their spines, break their limbs, shatter their bodies, and rip their spirits from their vessels. The war was going to end. The old mansion stood nestled on the grove of the dead, blackened trees. It was barely damaged, surviving the war and all these years afterwards. It seemed to have once been the stronghold for soldiers fighting in the war. Guns lay propped against the wall. Burlap sacks filled the sand wrestled in the corner. However, it had appeared to have been made in some sort of bed for someone too young to be fighting in a war. Panting heavily, the Stitchpunk clan sat in the soothed black marble fireplace, gasping for breath and smiling at one another in relief. 6 slowly set down 4 in the book, laying desolately on the floor and covered with the dust of time. The young stitch punk looked at the rip of his leg with a pained expression. Gray clasped his arm with a worried look. 6 stood beside them, twirling his key in his hands. However, 5 soon appeared, panting heavily. The twins caught sight of him and extended their arms towards the mechanic. Their eyes flickered in cries of relief at seeing their friend alive. 5 came over to them, hugging them tightly and patting the back of their heads lovingly. He's hurt, 6 said quietly to 5, laying his head upon the floor. The healer looked at the rip of the younger Stitchpunk's leg and nodded. He bent before 4, slid his pack from his shoulder, and fished around for a needle and some thread. Everyone was now gathered around the same general area. The last to stagger wearily around the house was 9. He was very weak, and his entire body trembled. He could barely walk. His sides ached every time he took a breath. However, he still looked up and made a head count, making sure everybody was safe. He saw 5 kneeling before 4, and his heart gave a painful jolt. He's hurt. Is he all right? 9 asked 5 as he limped over as fast as he possibly could. 5 smiled up at him. He's going to be fine. See? He said to 9 comfortably, pulling the last of the thread through the rip. 4 flexed his leg and smiled widely at 5, 9, and his brother. 9 sighed in relief, comforted in knowing that the 2 little ones were all right. That's my boy, 2 said softly, relieved in his voice. He kneeled beside 5, reaching forward and hugging him tightly. 5 hugged his mentor back, smiling softly. 9 stood beside him, giving him a small smile at the scene. Suddenly, he began to feel dizzy, his sides giving a sharp twinge of pain. He knew he needed a rest now, before he fell apart at the seams. Looking around the room, 9 saw a pile of soft-looking blankets and pillows slunched over the burlap sacks. He began to walk towards the blankets, wanting nothing more than to rest his aching body. However, the shock from his injuries was beginning to wear off. The weakness made him stagger, finally unable to take one more step. His knees buckled underneath him and he collapsed. 5 trembled as he lay upon the wooden floor, breathing heavily. His eyes closed, wanting nothing more than to sink down to the deep, painless sleep. 9, are you all right? 7 asked, stooping beside him. He blinked open his eyes and looked up at her. There was a haze in his eyes, but he could still see her beautiful face. He nodded, laying back down. He didn't know when he would be able to get back up. For now, he was exhausted and was content to just lie on the floor, just as long as he managed to get some sleep. 5 looked up at 2 and rushed over to 9. He kneeled beside him, resting a hand on his back. 9, 5 asked him softly, and he opened his eyes once more with effort. He looked up at his 2 best friends above him and smiled. Reaching up, he rested his shaking hand on the back of 5's neck, breaking him down so he could rest his forehead against his own. He couldn't fathom his relief, and the mechanic had made it out alive, that he hadn't lost his best friend. 5 smiled gently, squeezing 9's shoulder. We're going to make it. I know it. We're going to make it, he said softly, letting his head drop again. 5 and 7 smiled down at their friend, shaking their heads as it never relented courage. 9 felt the deep heaviness of sleep began to overtake him, and he closed his eyes, wincing as he could breathe, and took a deep breath. Suddenly he felt something slip their arms underneath him and lift his weary body. Opening his eyes, he saw that 5 was carrying him towards the pile of blankets and pillows. 7 walking up beside him, 5 laid him down gently on the blankets, resting his head against the pillows. He sighed, leaning back against it, and breathing became easier. Thank you, both of you." He sighed softly, looking up at them with warm eyes. They smiled at him. The older Stitch Punks then looked up at Seven. She was smiling at Nine in a tender way, and Five grinned wider. He knew, of course he knew. "I've got to check on the others," he told Nine, patting his shoulder and dismissing himself. Nine glanced after him, then slumped against the pillows. He wasn't terribly comfortable, but it was much better than the floor. "Are you okay, Seven? Are you okay?" Seven asked him. He looked up at her, smiling. "Yeah, I'm all right. Thank you," he said. Seven smiled back at him, pushing her skullmet up with her index finger. She then reached up and warmly clasped his hand. She squeezed back, the two looking at one another with great appreciation and affection for the other. Those strange glowing embers in her soul burned brighter than ever before, though she wasn't quite sure why. She made no effort to extinguish them. End of chapter 21.